Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Who's funding this stuff anyway? I'm very excited to talk to our guest today. Before I introduce them, I want to make sure you know who the voices are in this podcast. Of course, there's me, Richard Littauer. Hello, everyone. I said I wasn't going to do that. And then we have another host on today, which I'm really excited to have some of my other hosts on. It's rare to see them. I'm just so excited. We have Eriol Fox calling in from England. Eriol, how are you doing?
Hello. It's lovely. The weather is fantastic here. That's your obligatory British person weather comment for this podcast.
Thank you so much. Although every time a British person says the weather is fantastic, part of my brain says climate change is happening and we should all be crying about that. But it's still nice. Eriol came in and said cool hair in the comment. I assume they were talking about themselves. But anyway, this is too much about us as hosts. Let's talk about our guest, Susan Kennedy, calling in from Washington, D.C. Susan is awesome, and I'm very excited to have her on today. Susan, how are you doing?
I'm doing really great. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. It's spring. It's lovely. I was just in D.C. last weekend, and it is just a beautiful place to live before the heat gets way too much. When it does get too much, though, at least you probably have an office of some sort, because you are a gainfully employed person. That's right. You are the program manager for the Open Technology Fund, which I've never really understood how OTF works and functions. Can you give me the spiel? What is OTF and what do you do there?
Okay, so OTF, the Open Technology Fund, is a nonprofit organization that promotes internet freedom in repressive contexts by supporting the research, development, implementation, and maintenance of anti-censorship and anti-surveillance technologies. So the way we kind of function, we are an independent nonprofit, but we get most of our funding through the US government via the US Agency for Global Media. So we are funded by Congress, but we are independent. So it is a kind of a unique structure, but we are an independent funder. So, I'm happy to jump in and talk a little bit about our funding mechanisms, but is that the intro that's useful for you for now?
So Congress sends money to you, but you're an independent agency and you work for all sorts of awesome tech that's going on. Is that the same as, say, the Sovereign Tech Fund in Germany, which is also government funded? How are you different?
Well, gosh, yes, we're both publicly funded, but I don't exactly know how the money gets into their bank account because Germany is different. But I do know for us, the Congress funds different agencies, like the Agency for Global Media, and there are different line items in the annual budget for the agency. And we are one of the line items. So this means that it is congressionally mandated that the US Agency for Global Media allocates some money each year to the Open Technology Fund. And so we are technically grant funded by the US Agency for Global Media. But because we're grant funded, we have relative flexibility to use the funding, obviously, within our remit to promote internet freedom.
For instance, OTF has funded things like Signal before, which is very confusing to me because when I think about congressional approval, I think of mainly about congressional jerks, in the sense that the U.S. Congress does not always have the best people sitting in the chairs. There are some amazing people in Congress. I'm not going to debate that. It's really, really nice. For instance, say Republicans in Congress. So how did money get to Signal from there? Doesn't anyone ever say, why are we funding this?
Our mission is to promote internet freedom in repressive contexts. And what this means is free and open access to information on the internet. Somehow, this is something that is still widely, at least on paper, pretty bipartisan. And we have support from both sides of the aisle.
So OTF now has this new endeavor going on, the FOSS Sustainability Fund, which is awesome. And can you talk to me a bit more about what it is and why FOSS is a surveilled repressive context that somehow fits OTF's mission?
Since OTF started back in 2012, we have only supported open source technologies. So although we focus on secure and privacy technologies with, like I mentioned, our anti-censorship, anti-surveillance remit, they all need to be open source. And so as from a sustainability perspective, we find that it's our duty of care as a funder to make sure that these technologies that we support from their inception, are able to be maintained and are set up for success. So we started to find, after some time that a lot of projects were squeezing in maintenance and sustainability activities into their Internet Freedom Fund, like technology development applications. That's our other flagship fund where we support new technologies, new features, and things like that. But we've found that like people were forcing it in where we really wanted to name it as the thing, I guess. So that made us think, you know what, we can dedicate resources to this specifically so that projects can be very intentional about what they are asking for rather than like forcing in a feature or an update they're not ready for when really what they want to do is like keep the lights on. And so that was the inspiration behind the FOSS Sustainability Fund, is really dedicating the space for projects to name maintenance activities and like community development work, things that keep the ecosystem running, more specifically devote resources for that.
That is super, super cool. I'm really glad that as a funder, you listened to people who just really wanted to get the next version out and didn't want to make something new. That is awesome. How large is the FOSS Sustainability Fund? How many mullahs are you spending out?
So for this round of funding, we aim to fund approximately 4 projects ranging for 24 months, 150,000 to 400,000 USD. But it is the reason why we are also actively fundraising. One thing I would love to mention is that in our pilot round of this fund, we matched our US government funding with support from a few different private donors, GitHub, Okta for Good, a Mid-Yarn Network, and the Schmitz Futures Plain Text Group. So they very, very generously donated to the launch of this new fund. And so we would love to see this fund grow in the future with support from a varied network of funders.
Awesome. I hope that works out. Like really, really cool. So I was going through my boxes of childhood things the other day, and I found my journal from when I was 12. And my journal showed me writing in Futhark, the ancient runes of Norway, because I wanted to hide I'm sad and lonely from anyone else who might be reading my journal. And if I were to go and put that into open source code and put it on GitHub, could I apply for this funding? Because that's anti-censorship technology, right? Like, what's the exact remit for how cool a project I have to be to apply? I'm
so glad you asked that. You can apply. There's no guarantee you would get funding, but it is an open application and online. So we encourage everyone who feels that they've read the call for proposals and feels like they fit to apply. That being said, we are looking for some specific criteria. So kind of the high level ones is we're looking for software that has been released for at least 3 years. We're looking to like maintain and sustain, not just, we have different funding mechanisms for new technology. We're also looking for projects that are being actively updated, that their code base is active, and there's evidence of that. If you are a tool or an app or anything user-facing, you demonstrate that you have active users and that there's an interest in the future of this technology. And we're also looking that the software that we're funding has many dependencies, because we want the money to kind of ripple back into the ecosystem as much as possible. So while you can apply, you might want to take some of that eligibility into consideration before you do so. And yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go into more depth there, but those are the high levels.
I love that Richard has put in the chat, hey, Eriol, ask about design, when my question is not really at all about design, but I can ask about design at some point, Susan. I would love to hear about how I think it's a fairly new fund, right? It's maybe it's about a year old, right? You said?
Yeah, we announced it last year, actually maybe a little over January last year. And then our pilot round launched in December. And then the open call for the first official public round is happening now. So it is still a baby. Yeah.
Right. And design is usually a thing that's a little late to the game in open source. So it's understandable that maybe it's not right on the sort of ballot for the first sort of round of funding. But my question was a little bit more exploratory than that, and maybe a tricky one. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on what and whether you think outputs of this fund could help inform what sustainability generally for FOSS looks like. So one of the things, I don't know if this makes sense, but we often have conversations at Sustain about what are actually the criteria needed, or what are the criteria in place for when like, what is sustainability? We actually have tons of conversations about what sustainability means. And something like that excites me about this kind of fund is through this fund, will we start to discover like the things like that come up at the top of the list of, oh yeah, we really want funding for this. We really want funding for this. Have you sort of discovered any of those like top level things that these projects really need or projects really need in order to be sustainable? Because they're unburdened, they can ask for like what they need, right, with this fund, as opposed to trying to fit into a box. So have you kind of started to discover like secret things that these projects have always wanted to have to be sustainable that are like unknown maybe previously?
So I love this question because part of the goal of having a pilot round is to work really closely with the 6 pilot projects about how the funding's going, if their like hypotheses are being tested properly, if things are going as planned, if there's things that they didn't account for in the initial road mapping process that they're like, oh man, actually this was sustainability number 1 issue. So we are actually actively talking to projects about this. However, it's still early. One thing I will say that has come up already is an identified need for more just community meetings, like actually interfacing with the contributors. We heard from one of our pilot projects is OpenVPN. They're onboarding new contributors, which is amazing. But they were talking about how important it is, because the project's been around 15 years or something, to have an opportunity to bring the community together and like actually get to know each other on a human level, not just in text boxes on a screen. And that's definitely an area we're thinking about. Okay, well, for these new applications coming in, like our projects building in space to have these community convenings, these opportunities to get together. Because I think every project has a long list of tasks that need to get done, but sometimes the like social engineering aspect is hard to understand how to fit in to a proposal. So I will say the FOSS Fund does try in our call for applications to be quite clear about the different what we call community and social activities versus the technical activities that we are looking for in applications. But I think there's definitely more to learn from the pilot round and future projects about how to prioritize those, what shape they might take, and things like that. So that's the first thing that came to mind. But we actually will be publishing a series of blog posts as we continue interviewing and talking to the pilot round. So keep an eye out for those because, like I mentioned, the goal of the pilot round was to share our learnings and iterate on the fund, but also because hopefully more funders will jump on this bandwagon. Like we'll have some public documentation for others to learn from as well. So keep an eye out for that.
That's awesome. I can't wait to hear all of the really interesting things that projects need for sustainability that aren't kind of tied to like a specific ask within funding. It's really cool, exciting stuff. I have maybe a short question in relation to that, which is, have you already started to think or had applications from projects that are looking at sunsetting, if that is even the term or winding down? I wonder how much of sustainability and this road mapping process is like, sometimes we think that FOSS will last forever and we hope that it will never go away, but actually maybe a sustainable roadmap is, well, this is where we want to get to and that's where we want to wind down. Has OTF or yourself or like any projects thought about like what is sustainability like as a life cycle for the product yet? Or is that like a future conversation yet to be had?
I think it's a wonderful question. And I definitely think it's a ongoing conversation. That specific example of sunsetting projects is not something we've seen yet, but I do think it's actually very important to think about that as an example of what sustainability might look like, what a form of sustainability might look like. So, I mean, I'm interested in the question and finding out answers. I think it's, like I said, it's still such a baby fund. We're learning as we go, but we do fund so many different sizes and shapes of projects as well. Like we fund not just digital infrastructure FOSS as we think of it, but we also are interested in apps and tools as well that might need long-term sustainability. And so because of these different shapes and forms that each project can take as well, like every individual project's definition of sustainability is going to be different. And so as far as like from the funder perspective, we're very resistant to like kind of have very, very strict definitions of like sustainability life cycles, because I think it's going to look different for each project. We still want to learn from them and inform them for future funding, of course. But yeah, I think maybe it's a little early to be able to comment on that specifically. But it's a very interesting question, and I'm glad you brought it up.
Another question I feel forced to ask because you're a funder is funding a few projects lends itself to the institutional issue of funding charismatic, awesome projects that are good at writing grants. Why not just fund the larger dependencies of Nebraskan developers who are working on the cool stuff that no one knows about? What went into the thinking of, hey, let's have an open application process instead of say, let's filter down and use crypto to pay all the developers ever? Don't do that. Why this way?
Yeah, I mean, we have our flagship Internet Freedom Fund has always been to my knowledge, has always been an open application process. And I mean, that's like the only way that I think I can imagine beginning to get the people who are not as well known, as not as well resourced and connected in the space to just be able to have a one button apply. Okay, let's try and get the funding here. And I will say we do look at every single application that comes in. The headline isn't, this is so-and-so from such and such big foundation. The headline is the name of the proposal and then the description of the project. And that's kind of by design because we want to look at every project and really hear about it from the applicant's perspective. That being said, like obviously, because of our criteria, a project needs to be around a certain amount of year or 3 years. And if they're an app or tool, have a certain amount of users. To a certain extent, we are looking for like pretty established projects, but that doesn't mean it needs to be in some kind of glamorous foundation or something like that. We are looking to fund a diversity of layers in the ecosystem, from core infrastructure to network communication and apps and tools and projects that have impact on other projects. And so as long as that's demonstrated, it doesn't need to be flashy. It just needs to have impact on the ecosystem.
So let's say I have a small program, let's call it WritePad. It has something to do with padding of CSS values and nothing else, but it just happens to be used by Tails and Tahoe FS and every other cool, awesome crypto projects in the universe. Can I apply with that project, even though it itself has nothing at all to do with your call?
You can. I will say, I always like to come down to like our end users, like what is Open Technology Fund? Why do we exist? We exist so that at-risk journalists and human rights defenders at the end of the day, like have the tools they need to access the internet safely without risking their lives. So that is obviously many, many, many layers removed from, you said WritePad, right? But we try and look for that pathway, right? So if Tails is using WritePad, why does Tails need to use WritePad? And what would happen if Tails couldn't anymore? If it's the answer is they can easily switch to something else, then maybe that's not the answer. If it's that this tiny little project is the actual cornerstone thing that all of these like secure encrypted tools rely on, and that would break, that's a huge deal. Even if it's a tiny project maintained by one person, that's something that has outsized impact on the users that we care about. So I am sensitive to is not every maintainer is going to be able to like build that whole big narrative. I think about our end users every day because that's our remit, but the WritePad maintainer isn't necessarily thinking about that. And so we are hoping that our application questions can be usefully guiding applicants in that way. Another thing I'd like to point out is that we do a 2-phase application process. And the first one is a lightweight concept note. And so we don't ask folks to spend a really, really long time with a really in-depth application as their like first go. They propose a project, they propose its impact, they make an argument for the things they need to be sustained, and we review it. And then we provide feedback. And that feedback might come with a dismissal, but it might come with a request for more information like, hey, could you please elaborate on these things? And then if they're successful, they'll make it to a fuller proposal where we will, again, be very specific about, we need this from you for this to be successful. Like you need to prove the XYZ. And so I find that this broken down process is helpful for applicants who have those questions. Like, does this fit within this call? Like, am I making the case for impact? Like, am I drawing the right things? Like, hopefully we can help guide them through that process in a useful way.
From personal-ish experience, one of the great things that OTF offers is like, it's not just a application process. I don't know whether you officially can call it advice. You would be the best person to say that, Susan, but there is intention and conversation and advice kind of in the process of like what is kind of proposed and applied for. So it's not a faceless application. There is like a conversation that is had about the best case scenario, which is always really cool. So I don't know if Richard's already asked this question, but it's kind of similar to the right pad question. So from my experience working in open source organizations previous to some of the ones that I'm working in right now, if somebody gave some money to work on sustainability, it would go on tech debt. It would go on the miasma of like unresolved issues from like 5, 10, 15 years ago. And often like the effort there is like about trying to figure out which are still relevant or not. And I think my question here is around what you think or what OTF's stance is around the tackling of tech debt, but also the efforts, and here's the design question, the efforts to be user informed when we think about sustainability funding for FOSS. Like, so how are the FOSS projects distinguishing tech debt from sustainability for their users? Or are those the same thing you found?
I actually think that these two things are very uniquely separate, right? So there's tech debt. Every project, like you said, has its list of backlog. We got to get these fixes out. But sometimes they're so old, they can be outdated for sure. I would say what we're looking for in applications is a balance of those tech debt maintenance lists of go-to like technical coding, sit down, like get this done things, but also the social and human elements as well. And that's both with communication with contributors as well as communications with users. So we want to make sure that projects kind of have more of a holistic perspective on sustainability because research has found, of course, and as you both know, it's the technical and the social sustainability that matters. So examples of like non-coding activities that we would support would be like establishing user feedback loops if they didn't exist previously. Like that's a huge sustainability exercise that we would love to see in applications. Long-term strategic planning, setting up a governance structure if one doesn't exist, improving a governance structure if one doesn't exist, things like this. These are like named activities that we love to see in sustainability applications. And I think if someone maybe submits an application that is a list of the tech debt that they're trying to solve for, I do think we would come back and ask, okay, so have you talked to users? Like when was the last time you talked to users? Things like that. So that is part of our definition of sustainability, which again was informed by interviews with projects. Actually, I don't know if I mentioned this. The FOSS Fund was initially shaped before I started by interviews with previously funded Internet Freedom Fund and other funded OTF projects about their experience with sustainability and challenges that they've had. So part of this like holistic definition came from feedback that we got from projects. And since design has come up in little tiny ways, I will shout out to our labs if this seems like a good moment to do that. So in addition to our funds, we do offer in-kind lab services. This has always been part of OTF's model of sustainability for tech projects. It applies as well to the FOSS Sustainability Fund, as well as our other funds, which is that projects can receive lab support from different labs. The first one is our security lab. This is required for all software development projects. It's required that they get security audits as part of their funding, but you can also apply separate from that. So reach out to us if you're interested. Another one is the Secure Usability and Accessibility Lab. So this lab is designed to provide user research, user discovery, usability, accessibility, and design support to open source projects. These things are incredibly important for the health and long-term existence of an open source project. And different open source projects have different levels of maturity with, I would say, being comfortable with these processes. So part of the lab is a coaching model too, to get to kind of meet projects where they are at and see like, okay, what do you need? How can we introduce usability and design services in an accessible way? And we also have a learning lab, which does communication support for projects, graphic design, writing and editing support. So if an open source project wants a huge update, but doesn't know how to share about it with the community in a compelling, accessible way, the learning lab might help them write up a blog post with some compelling images to do that. And then I'm forgetting our other lab.
Localization lab?
Yes, thank you, Eriol. Localization lab, which localizes our tech projects into languages for their end users. So we can translate basically anything into any language around the world. So yeah, these services are intended to be in addition to what would be funded by the FOSS Fund as other ways to achieve sustainability in these different areas.
I think the interesting thing about what you're saying here about the labs and also like the interaction with OTF is that sometimes it's okay to not know exactly, other than maybe knowing that you have a list of tech debt in your backlog, but not knowing exactly what you want to do to get to sustainability. There is like resources there to have that conversation. You don't have to know all the answers, right? Of this is how we get to sustainability. But like that, I think what you're saying is that interest on knowing how to get there is like the first step of this process, is like a small project that has ambitions to be that project to support every project that is using that bit of CSS that it needs to explore. Then there are options, right, for exploring what sustainability means through these other offerings that OTF has.
So this all sounds great. It's a relatively small fund. This is not $1 billion for open source, to quote Toby Langell. So it's great that it exists. One of the questions I have is that this process is not going to work for everyone. They're going to apply for this, and then they won't get it because it's selective, right? Is there anything that you're offering to people who don't get in? Are there any learnings that you're going to take from the people who do end up being granted funds? Are there any expectations that they would help instruct and inform their peers with how to make more sustainable projects?
We do maintain a list of alternate funding sources that we share with projects. Not to answer your question with too much pessimism, but as you both know, it is still a woefully underfunded and supported space. So part of our goal in sharing things as funders publicly about our learnings will be for other funders to hopefully learn from and work with us to fund FOSS sustainability efforts. So long term, I mean, there's a long way to go. There needs to be a lot more money from this space from many, many more diverse sources. But when it comes to applicants, we invite them to check out this list, and we do encourage every project across all of our funds to share their reporting and learnings publicly. That's one of the things we look at all of our applications is like, okay, so how are you sharing back to the community? But I think it's a great prompt that you have about dismissed projects, how we can keep the successful projects giving back to the community is very important.
Are there any requirements for projects to help fund the dependencies or the wider ecosystem which they depend upon?
We are looking for projects that have many dependencies and that have built in patching back into their roadmaps. We don't have a requirement that they go back and fund, but we do want to see the dependencies supported. So that is a key question in our application.
Looking ahead a few years, what would be like your dream vision for this fund?
10 times the amount of money supporting 10 times the amount of projects. I hate that the answer is money, but there's, like you said, there are many, 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 many more projects than there are resources currently to support them. But I would like to see more funder coordination. I would like to see more diverse funders getting into this space. I would like to see more funders paying attention to some of the things we talked about, like the importance of community management, governance, and design and usability as aspects of sustainability, all of these things. But in general, I mean, I hope in that time we will have learned a lot from the projects we've already funded and just continue maximizing the impact based on what we've learned.
I agree with that. Yes, that'd be awesome. That'd be super, super cool. I have more questions. I think we always have more questions because we don't have all the answers yet and we have so much to learn, which is great. That's why we're here. This is exciting. But we are running up on time. So, Susan, where can people learn more about this? Where can people go to apply? When is the closing deadline?
Thank you so much. So everyone can go to opentech.fund/funds. and you'll see the FOSS Sustainability Fund on that list. There's a longer URL for that exact page, but when we share this out, we can have the full one. But opentech.fund/funds, you'll see all of our funds. The FOSS Sustainability Fund is open until May 17th, which is very, very soon. And I realize listeners might be like, oh no, I hope there's enough time. So I would definitely try, if you're interested in applying, to get in your concept note in by that date. But if you have a concern, reach out, because I don't want anyone to fall through the cracks if it's an important project. But keep in mind, like I mentioned, the first phase is a concept note. So that's a much briefer application. The bigger one comes later. So you might be able to squeeze in one before the May 17th deadline before you have to do a larger proposal. And then we hope through the concept note proposal review process to have projects selected and funded by mid-fall. So
amazing. That is super cool. And since you took the time to come on this podcast itself, where can people learn more about you and your work, if not just at OTF?
I am actually notoriously not online, but I do have a LinkedIn where I'm OTFE, and then I have my bio on the OpenTech website, but I can share my LinkedIn, I suppose. If folks are interested, I'm always happy to share my email and be in touch. So
I see you have been on the internet before. Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing those links. And we'll also have all these links in the show notes, listeners, so you can grab them there. One last question. I hear there's an OTF Talk mailing list, right? Is that openly accessible?
Yeah, I would have folks reach out to me at susan@opentech.fund, and I would help set them up with that.
Sweet. Sounds dope. Don't leave yet, though. At the end of every single Sustained podcast, we have the best part of the podcast, which is the spotlight, where we highlight people, projects, things, books, or dog toys, anything that really has helped you out in your life and or led you to a better way of understanding open source and the world at large. For our guests, we normally ask for people who've inspired them. For our hosts who have done way too many of these, it's just whatever you really feel like on that day. So I'm going to highlight Rudyard Kipling, who is an incredibly horrible person and a product of his time. Very, very capitalist and sexist and misogynist and racist. But built a beautiful house in Vermont that I had the privilege of spending this weekend in, filled with lovely books by lovely, amazing authors. And the Jungle Book is a source of joy for millions of kids who don't know any better. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to the Nalaka House in Brattleboro. If you're ever in Vermont and you need a lovely place to stay, it was really quite cool. Eriol, what's your spotlight today?
I really want to go to that house now, Richard. My spotlight for today is I've had the absolute pleasure of talking to the Code for Japan folks a fair bit over the couple of months, because they are preparing for their next hackathon, which is the Facing the Ocean hackathon, which sees South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan all come together in one of those locations to do a civic tech hackathon. If you want to find out when Facing the Ocean is, you can find out by searching for Facing the Ocean on your favorite search engine and hackathon. Yokohama, Japan is the location. The date is the 17th and 18th of August in 2024. And if you would like to hear more about the people that are organizing that hackathon and what they do around civic tech and Code for Japan, you can go to the podcast called Chit Chat Code, which is hosted by the Code for Japan folks over there in their Tokyo office. A fantastic podcast to listen to. Episodes are only 15 minutes long, so they're a quick listen.
Yatta! That's excellent. That sounds super cool. Sweet. Thank you, Eriol. Susan, what's your spotlight today?
Yeah, so this one's a bit of a throwback. I think it's back from 2020. In preparing for this podcast, I was thinking about my trajectory through FOSS sustainability and what my first touch point was. And it was actually this report by Implicit Development Environments, which is Super Lab, and was supported by Super Bloom, where I used to work, but before I worked there. It's called Roadwork Ahead, Evaluating the Needs of FOSS Communities Working on Digital Infrastructure in the Public Interest. It explores many things, but it also looks at the tensions of that many critical digital infrastructure communities have with traditional funding models and different styles of resistance with funding. And it really inspired me to hear different perspectives on what sustainability means and think about how we can approach funding FOSS more practically and empathetically and really listen to communities. It's a very accessible, digestible report, but I realized had a huge impact on me in many ways. Back when I was doing human-centered design research, just the method of interviewing and distilling perspectives in an accessible, recommendations-driven report was inspiring. And then also thinking about a community of people who might actually be like, money, and how complicated that topic is. Like, I think that I really learned so much from that. It built on the famous Roads and Bridges Eqbal report, and then also influenced a future initiative at Superbloom, the Digital Infrastructure Funders Toolkit as well, which kind of helped build on some of those recommendations a little bit. But yeah, that's a hugely interesting report if you want to learn a bit more about the needs of digital infrastructure communities and the challenges they have with funding.
That sounds great. And we'll link that in the show notes. Speaking of the show notes, another thing that came out of Nadia's report and Nadia's work, as well as other sources, was a community of listeners who are dedicated to understanding what is open source software. And look, here we are today on the Sustain podcast. And yes, we listen too. If you have any comments on this podcast, you can email us at podcast@sustainoss.org. It always makes me happy to hear that there's actually someone else on the other line. The code word is banana. As well, you can rate this podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else where podcasts are vended. You can follow us on Blue Sky. You can follow us on Mastodon and LinkedIn. Please do so. You can join our discourse at discourse.sustainoss.org, where we always post a topic for this sort of thing. And of course, you can go on our Slack, which is the Open Collective Slack. So please get in touch. And if you want to hear more of these podcasts, you could pay us. Yeah, straight out. We need money, man. That's how it goes. That's cool. My coffee isn't free. So if you would like to, you can go to opencollective.com/sustainoss and donate there. I hate marketing. I should really apply to this Open Technology Fund for this open source work that we're doing. Interesting. Okay. At this point, I'm running out of steam. Thank you all for listening. Susan, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great to have you. Good luck. Hopefully people are able to take this and run with it and apply, and let us know how it goes.
Thank you so much. This has been great.